You were in that room?
My room, not Xana's room. My room.
And your room is this one right here?
Next to the stairs. That one is Xana's room.
Second floor room.
Second floor.
Okay.
All I heard was I heard her go upstairs. Like, okay, I'm gonna go to sleep now because she's going upstairs.
And you heard who go upstairs?
Kaylee and the dog Murphy.
And upstairs to the very top?
Yeah, that's where her room is.
Okay.
And then all of a sudden I heard her walking up, I heard her scream, and she ran downstairs because she saw someone. That's what I'm pretty sure she said. Someone's here, and she screamed and just ran downstairs. And I called for her name, but I jumped up and locked my door because I was so scared. And then I heard someone in the bathroom, and I heard her crying, and I heard some guy say that you're going to be okay, I'm going to help you. And I kept calling her name, but she wasn't answering. And then I opened the door for a second, and I saw this guy, and he was not insanely tall, but he was wearing all black and like this mask that was just covering his forehead and his mouth. And I locked the door and I called and I didn't know what to do.
This was at 4
a.m. Yes. Okay. And so then I just ran down.
You left here?
Yeah, I left my room down to she's that one with the white blinds at the very bottom. I ran down there and we talked and we just locked the door. We didn't think anything of it. We're like, nothing happens in Moscow, so we just like tried to go to bed. And then we woke up and it was weird because none of our roommates were up. And we called all of them, they were not waking up. And so me and like, this is weird. So I called and to come over and then that's when all this happened.
Who all lives here with you?
Me, that blonde right there.
Okay. Who's Xana?
Xana is the girl in there.
Is the girl that lives this floor?
Yeah.
Okay. How do you spell her name?
Xana.
Do you know if she has a middle name?
Alexis, I think.
Do you know what her last name is?
Kernodle. K. I don't know how to spell it really. K. You know? R-N-O-D-L.
K-A-E-R.
K-E-R.
K-E-R.
N-O.
N-O.
L-E.
D-L-E? Okay.
X-A-N-A.
X-A-N-A. Okay.
Ethan, who's in there, he doesn't actually live here, but he's here like almost all the time.
Ethan is a male that lives here, and he
doesn't actually live here. He's in the room with Xana, I believe.
He's in there right now.
But he doesn't live here, but he's here a lot. And then there's Madison Mogen and Kaylee up top. I don't know where they're at though.
Madison
Mogen. And
Madison Mogen.
Yeah.
And who?
Kaylee Goncalves. She's the girl that I was talking about, Kaylee, who I just heard her go upstairs and then run back down the stairs.
Okay. And the guy.
The small college town of Moscow, Idaho had always been the kind of place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. Quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and late-night laughter from college students drifting through the cold Idaho air. It was the kind of town where nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen. But in the early hours of November 13, 2022, something did. Something so brutal, so unthinkable, that it would shake the entire country. Before I continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more real and disturbing crime stories like the case of Bryan Kohberger. And don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who loves true crime. 4 young students from the University of Idaho were inside a rented house just a few blocks from campus. Like many college students, they had spent the evening out with friends before returning home in the early morning hours. The house, located at 1122 King Road, was known for gatherings, laughter, and the ordinary chaos of college life. Inside that home were Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. They were young, full of plans, full of life. By sunrise, all 4 of them would be dead. At first, no one in the neighborhood noticed anything unusual. The streets were quiet. The town slept peacefully. But behind the walls of that house, a horrifying crime had already taken place. A masked intruder had slipped inside under the cover of darkness, carrying a large knife, moving silently through the room.
Where's she at?
She's at cellphone. Yes, she's
Where at? You got her up here? Up here. You got her call and let her know that someone was normal, and I just came to check in here and see what I just found.
College students had been brutally stabbed to death while inside their own home. There were signs of a violent struggle. Blood, chaos, and a question that would haunt everyone involved in the case. Who could have done this? And why? The news spread like wildfire across the United States. A quiet college town had suddenly become the center of a national nightmare. Parents rushed to call their children, students locked their doors in fear, rumors flooded social media. Was a serial killer on the loose? Had the victims known their attacker? Or had someone simply walked into that house and chosen them at random? For weeks, investigators worked around the clock, chasing leads, analyzing evidence, and trying to piece together the final moments of the victims' lives. Thousands of tips poured in. Every possible suspect was examined, yet the killer remained invisible. But what no one realized at the time was that the person responsible for this brutal crime had been watching, planning, and studying crime itself. Just a few miles away from the crime scene lived a man named Bryan Kohberger, a criminology PhD student at Washington State University. A man who had spent years studying the minds of criminals. A man who, investigators would later say, may have believed he understood how to commit the perfect crime. But one tiny mistake would eventually bring the entire investigation crashing down on him. And when police finally uncovered the truth, it revealed a story darker, stranger, and more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Because the question was never just who committed the murders. The real question was far more terrifying. Why would someone slaughter 4 innocent students and then refuse to ever explain why? Why? Why would someone slaughter 4 innocent college students in their own home and then remain completely silent about it? In the days that followed the discovery of the murders, the quiet town of Moscow, Idaho transformed overnight. Police sirens echoed through streets that were normally silent. News vans lined the roads near the off-campus house on King Road. Yellow crime scene tape wrapped around the property like a grim warning. Students from the University of Idaho stood in small groups outside dormitories and coffee shops, whispering in shock. Many had known the victims, others had simply seen them around campus. But everyone felt the same thing: fear. For years, Moscow had been known as one of the safest college towns in America. Violent crime was extremely rare. Parents felt comfortable sending their children there. Students walked home late at night without much concern. Now that sense of safety had been shattered. Inside the police department, investigators were already facing a nightmare. The victims had been brutally stabbed with what authorities believed was a large fixed-blade knife. There were no signs of forced entry. The killer had moved through the house during the early morning hours of November 13, 2022. And somehow no one had stopped him. The victims were identified as Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. 4 lives cut short in a way that investigators would later describe as both violent and deeply personal. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen were best friends. They had grown up together and remained inseparable through college. Kaylee had recently purchased a new car and was preparing to move to Texas for a job opportunity after graduation. Madison had dreams of building a career in marketing. Xana Kernodle was known among friends for her energy and warmth. She worked hard at school and balanced her studies with a job. Her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, was visiting that night. Ethan was a freshman and a member of a fraternity, known for his easy smile and friendly personality. None of them could have imagined the horror that would unfold inside their home that night. Investigators began by reconstructing the final hours before the murders. Kaylee and Madison had spent part of the evening at a local bar in downtown Moscow. Surveillance footage showed them laughing with friends, ordering food, and enjoying what appeared to be a completely ordinary night out. At around 1:40 a.m., they were seen at a food truck in the downtown area, waiting with other students for late-night snacks. Video footage later released to the public showed the 2 friends chatting and smiling while they waited for their order. Eventually, they caught a ride back to the house on King Road. Meanwhile, Xana and Ethan had attended a party at Ethan's fraternity house. Sometime after 1:45 a.m., the couple returned to the residence. By around 2:00 a.m., all 4 victims were back inside the house. It should have been the end of a normal Saturday night. But somewhere in the darkness outside, someone else was already moving closer. Investigators would later piece together a chilling timeline. They believed the killer entered the home sometime between 4:00 and 4:25 in the morning. The house itself had 3 floors. On the top floor were the bedrooms of Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen. On the second floor lived Xana Kernodle. That same floor also had the kitchen and living area. 2 other roommates were in the house that night as well. Both were sleeping in bedrooms on the lower level. Miraculously, they survived. At some point during the early morning hours, one of the surviving roommates woke up. She later told investigators that she heard strange noises upstairs, what sounded like someone moving around. At first, she assumed one of the roommates had simply come home late. Then she heard something else. A voice. According to court documents, she believed she heard someone say something like, "There's someone here." Confused and half asleep, she opened her bedroom door and looked out into the hallway. Everything seemed quiet. She closed the door again. Moments later, she heard crying coming from another room. Then another voice. A man's voice. He said something that investigators would later reveal in chilling detail. "It's okay, I'm going to help you." The roommate opened her door again, trying to understand what was happening. And that was when she saw him. A man dressed in dark clothing walking past her toward the sliding glass door. His face was partially covered. The only detail she clearly remembered was his eyes and his thick eyebrows. For a moment, the two were only a few feet apart. Then he walked out of the house. She stood frozen in shock. At the time, she had no idea that the man she had just seen had murdered 4 people inside that home. Hours passed before police were called. Friends had come to the house after one of the roommates became concerned that something was terribly wrong. When officers finally entered the residence, they quickly realized the situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. 4 students were dead. The brutality of the attack stunned investigators. Detectives immediately began collecting evidence: blood samples, fingerprints, fibers, footprints, anything that might reveal the identity of the killer. But there was a problem. The attacker had left very little behind. In fact, during the early stages of the investigation, authorities publicly admitted they had no suspect. Days passed. Then weeks. The case quickly became national news. Media outlets across the country covered every new development. Armchair detectives on social media began analyzing every detail they could find. Some theories suggested the victims had been targeted by someone they knew. Others believed the killer might be a serial predator who had randomly chosen the house. The uncertainty only made the fear worse. Meanwhile, investigators quietly focused on a small but crucial clue. Not far from the crime scene, surveillance cameras had captured a vehicle repeatedly driving through the neighborhood during the early morning hours of the murders. The car appeared to be a white sedan. More specifically, detectives believed it was a white Hyundai Elantra. The vehicle was spotted multiple times near the house between 3:30 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. Police began searching for the driver. At first, they simply asked the public for help identifying the car. But behind the scenes, investigators were already digging deeper. As they reviewed footage from traffic cameras, gas stations, and residential security systems, they began tracking the vehicle's movements across multiple locations. The same white car kept appearing. It moved through the quiet streets of Moscow. Then it disappeared toward the highway leading out of town. Whoever had been driving that car had been very close to the house, at the exact time the murders were believed to have happened. For investigators, the vehicle quickly became one of the most important leads in the case. Still, there was another piece of evidence that would later prove even more critical. Inside the house, detectives discovered something small, something that could easily have been overlooked. Lying near one of the victims was a knife sheath. The sheath appeared to belong to a military-style knife. But the knife itself was missing. At first glance, the object might not have seemed important, yet forensic specialists immediately recognized its potential value. Because on that sheath there was DNA. Just a tiny trace. But it would eventually lead investigators directly to the man they were searching for. A man who had been studying criminal behavior. A man who believed he understood how killers think. A man named Bryan Kohberger. At the time, however, no one outside the investigation knew his name. And while the town of Moscow waited anxiously for answers, the killer was still out there. Driving the same roads. Living only minutes away. Watching the investigation unfold on the news, just like everyone else. But the closer investigators looked at the evidence, the more they began to realize something chilling. This crime had not been random. Someone had planned it. Someone had studied the house. And someone had been watching those students long before the night they died. What detectives didn't know yet was just how many times the killer had already been near that house before the murders ever happened. Investigators now believed the killer hadn't simply stumbled upon that house on King Road. The evidence was starting to suggest something far more disturbing. Whoever committed the murders had likely been there before. Many times. Inside the investigation room at the police department in Moscow, Idaho, detectives stared at hours upon hours of surveillance footage. Every street camera, every traffic light camera, every nearby security system had become a potential witness. And one vehicle kept appearing again and again. A white Hyundai Elantra. The car had been captured driving near the victim's house several times in the weeks leading up to the murders, sometimes late at night, sometimes in the early hours of the morning. At first it seemed like a coincidence. But coincidences begin to disappear when the same car shows up again and again and again. Investigators widened their search. They began checking vehicle registration databases across multiple states, looking for anyone who owned a white Hyundai Elantra that could match the model seen on camera. Thousands of vehicles fit the description. But detectives weren't just looking for a car. They were looking for behavior. As analysts traced the vehicle's movements from camera to camera, they noticed something chilling about the night of November 13. The car didn't just pass through the neighborhood once. It circled the area several times, driving past the house, turning around, coming back again, like someone watching, waiting. Then, around the time investigators believed the murders occurred, the car suddenly sped away from the neighborhood. After that, it disappeared into the darkness. But the digital trail it left behind was beginning to reveal a story. Meanwhile, forensic investigators were studying the small piece of evidence discovered inside the house, the knife sheath left behind at the crime scene. It had been found near the body of Madison Mogen. The sheath appeared to belong to a Kabar-style combat knife, a weapon commonly associated with military use. But the knife itself had never been recovered. What mattered more was the microscopic trace left on the metal snap of the sheath. DNA. At first, the genetic profile didn't match anyone in the National Criminal Database. That meant the killer had likely never been arrested before. But investigators had another tool available, one that had helped solve several major cold cases in recent years. Genetic genealogy. Instead of searching for an exact DNA match, analysts began comparing the sample to publicly available genealogy databases. These databases allowed investigators to identify distant relatives of the person whose DNA had been left behind. It was a painstaking process that involved building entire family trees. Branch by branch, generation by generation, slowly narrowing down potential suspects. While forensic experts worked on the DNA, other investigators were chasing the lead involving the white Hyundai Elantra. Eventually, they made an important discovery. Just across the state line at Washington State University, campus police had recently recorded the license plate of a vehicle that matched the description investigators were searching for. The car belonged to a graduate student. His name was Bryan Kohberger. At first glance, Kohberger didn't seem like the kind of person anyone would suspect in a quadruple homicide. He was 28 years old, a PhD student studying criminology. Someone who had spent years learning about criminal psychology, forensic science, and the motivations behind violent crime. In fact, before moving to Washington, he had attended DeSales University, where he completed a master's degree in criminal justice. According to former classmates, Kohberger had shown a deep fascination with how criminals think. At one point, he had even posted an online survey asking former offenders to describe their emotions while committing crimes. Investigators began looking more closely at him. And the more they learned, the more unsettling the picture became. Kohberger lived in Pullman, Washington, just about 10 miles from Moscow. An easy drive. Less than 20 minutes. When detectives checked his vehicle registration records, they found something interesting. He owned a white Hyundai Elantra. The same type of car seen circling the victim's neighborhood on the night of the murders. But there was more. Phone records would soon reveal something even more disturbing. When investigators obtained a warrant to examine Kohberger's cell phone data, they discovered that his phone had been near the victim's house multiple times in the months before the murders. Not once, not twice, but at least a dozen times. Late at night, early in the morning, almost as if someone had been visiting the area repeatedly. Possibly watching, possibly planning. Then came the most suspicious detail of all. During the exact time window when the murders were believed to have occurred, Kohberger's phone stopped transmitting location data. It simply went silent. No signals. No pings. Nothing. But shortly after the estimated time of the murders, the phone suddenly reappeared on the network again. Moving away from Moscow. Heading south. Then returning to Pullman. For investigators, the pattern was impossible to ignore. But they still needed more evidence before making an arrest. Meanwhile, the DNA analysis from the knife sheath had finally produced a potential breakthrough. Genealogy researchers had managed to narrow the DNA profile down to a specific family line. From there, investigators began quietly examining male relatives who could possibly match the genetic profile. Eventually, the trail led them toward a family living in Pennsylvania. One of the relatives in that family tree was Bryan Kohberger. At that point, detectives began secretly watching him, tracking his movements, monitoring his behavior. And what they saw only made them more suspicious. In December 2022, Kohberger traveled across the country with his father, driving from Washington state to Pennsylvania for the holidays. The trip covered more than 2,000 miles. Investigators from the FBI joined local authorities in quietly surveilling him during that time. They followed him. They watched him. They waited. At one point, agents reportedly observed Kohberger late at night, wearing gloves while placing trash into a neighbor's garbage bin instead of his own. Investigators suspected he might be trying to hide his DNA. But the surveillance team was already several steps ahead. One night, under the cover of darkness, agents collected discarded trash from the Kohberger family home. Inside the garbage were items containing biological material. Investigators sent the samples to the lab for testing. If the DNA from that trash matched the DNA from the knife sheath, they would finally have the proof they needed. Days later, the results came back. The DNA from the trash was linked to Kohberger's father, which meant the DNA on the knife sheath was almost certainly from Bryan Kohberger. After weeks of fear, speculation, and unanswered questions, investigators finally had their suspect. The man they believed had brutally murdered 4 college students. But the story was far from over. Because the arrest that followed would reveal just how close the killer had come to getting away with it. And even after the evidence stacked up against him, one terrifying question would remain unanswered. Why did he do it? Inside a forensic laboratory, scientists compared the DNA profile taken from the knife sheath at the crime scene with the DNA recovered from trash outside a family home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. The result was clear. The genetic material belonged to the same family line as the father of Bryan Kohberger. For investigators, it was the final piece of the puzzle. Weeks of fear, uncertainty, and relentless investigation had finally led them to the man they believed was responsible for the brutal murders of 4 students from the University of Idaho. But even with the evidence building against him, the operation to arrest Kohberger had to be handled carefully. Authorities feared that if he realized he was under suspicion, he might destroy evidence or worse, disappear. So they waited. In the early hours of December 30, 2022, tactical teams surrounded the quiet Pennsylvania home where Kohberger was staying with his parents. The neighborhood was still asleep when officers approached the house. Then the command was given. Police forced their way inside. Within moments, Bryan Kohberger was in handcuffs. The 28-year-old criminology PhD student was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. For the first time since the killings, the town of Moscow, Idaho had a name for the person they believed had shattered their community. But the arrest raised almost as many questions as it answered. Because to many people who knew him, Kohberger didn't fit the image of a mass killer. He had been a graduate student at Washington State University, studying criminology only miles from the crime scene. His field of study focused on criminal behavior. He had spent years learning how investigators analyze crime scenes, how suspects are identified, how killers are caught, which made the case feel even more chilling. The man accused of committing one of the most shocking murders in recent American history had literally been studying crime itself. In the weeks after his arrest, investigators began revealing more details about the evidence they believed connected Kohberger to the murders. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence was the DNA discovered on the knife sheath left at the crime scene. The sheath had been found next to the body of Madison Mogen. It belonged to a Ka-Bar-style combat knife, a weapon designed to be extremely lethal. The knife itself was never recovered. But the sheath had carried something even more dangerous to the killer: his DNA. Then there was the white Hyundai Elantra. Surveillance cameras had captured the vehicle repeatedly circling the victim's neighborhood in the early morning hours of November 13, 2022. Investigators later confirmed that Kohberger owned the same model of car. Phone records added another disturbing layer to the case. Data from Kohberger's cell phone suggested he had been near the victim's house at least 12 times in the months leading up to the murders. Late nights, early mornings, repeated visits to the same quiet street. Prosecutors would later argue that this pattern suggested surveillance. Someone studying the house, studying the victims, preparing. Then came the most suspicious detail of all. During the exact window when investigators believe the murders took place, Kohberger's phone stopped transmitting data. It went completely silent. But shortly afterward, the phone reappeared on the network, moving away from Moscow. Back toward Pullman. Back toward his apartment. When police searched his apartment and vehicle, they began collecting additional evidence, hoping to uncover anything that might explain the motive behind the attack. But that question, the one haunting investigators from the beginning, remained unanswered. Why? Why would someone break into a house and brutally stab 4 young students to death? The victims had been full of life and possibility. Kaylee Goncalves had been preparing to move across the country to start a new job. Her best friend, Madison Mogen, had been celebrating the final months of college. Xana Kernodle had been balancing school, work, and her relationship with her boyfriend. And Ethan Chapin had just begun his college journey, surrounded by friends and family who adored him. Their families were left with unimaginable grief. And they would soon have a chance to confront the man accused of taking their children's lives. The court proceedings that followed captured national attention. Inside the courtroom, Bryan Kohberger often appeared calm, even emotionless. He rarely spoke.
They had a great impact on me, and the impact was when she was gone, I realized how important she was and what she really did for me, influenced me, was way beyond what I ever thought. She'd call me up on the weekends, check on me.
But the courtroom atmosphere changed completely when the victims' families were allowed to speak. One by one, parents, siblings, and loved ones addressed him directly. Some cried. Some shouted. Some struggled just to find the words. One father looked directly at Kohberger and delivered a message filled with anger and pain. He told him that no one cared about him. That he would be forgotten. That the world would remember the victims, not the man who killed them. The statements were so emotional that even the judge was seen wiping away tears. For the families, it was a moment of raw grief. A moment to say what had been building inside them for months. Then the time came for sentencing. Kohberger faced the possibility of the death penalty. But prosecutors eventually reached an agreement in which he pleaded guilty to the murders. In exchange, the death penalty would be removed. Instead, he would spend the rest of his life in prison. When the judge finally addressed him directly, the words were sharp and unforgettable. He called Kohberger a coward. He described the crime as a senseless slaughter. And he referred to the defendant as one of the worst offenders the court had ever seen. Kohberger was given 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole, 1 for each of the victims. He also received an additional 10-year sentence for burglary. And the court ordered him to pay financial restitution to the families. Then the judge gave him a final opportunity to speak. The courtroom fell silent. For a moment, it seemed possible that the world might finally hear the answer everyone had been waiting for. Why? Why those 4 students? Why that house? Why that night? But Kohberger simply looked forward and said quietly, "I respectfully decline." And with those 3 words, the mystery at the center of the case remained unsolved. To this day, investigators have never identified a clear motive. No confirmed connection between Kohberger and the victims has ever been proven. No explanation has been offered. 4 lives were taken in one of the most brutal crimes in recent American history. A killer was caught. Justice in the eyes of the law was delivered. But the most haunting question of all still lingers in the silence he left behind.